Hi everyone, and welcome to Eco Canada's Environmental Insider webinar series. Today's session is called What Bears Teach Us, and I'm really glad that you could all join us for today's webinar, particularly as yesterday was the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And whilst we aren't able to travel and experience Canada's parks and wild places right now due to COVID-19, today's presentation is going to help all of us get an insight into bear ecology and what this means for how we live and work in bear country. Our guest speaker, Sarah Elmeligi, is going to talk about her work researching grizzly bears in Western Canada. My name is Hannah Williamson, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. Before we start, there's just a few housekeeping guidelines that I want to run through to make sure we can all participate and enjoy the webinar effectively. First of all of our participants today are muted, so please check your audio settings to make sure that you can hear us correctly. And if you're experiencing any technical issues, please use the questions box and select question for staff, and we'll do everything that we can to resolve the issue quickly. I will do a quick caveat now because we know that COVID-19 is causing a lot of people to work from home and putting extra pressure on bandwidth. So if you do have any technical issues today that cause you to get kicked out, lose audio, not be able to kind of participate and enjoy the whole session effectively, please don't worry. We're recording today's session, and everyone who's on the line and everyone who registered will get an email within 24 hours of the session ending, and that will have a link where you can watch the video as many times as you like. If you do have any questions about today's presentation or today's topic, and we do really enjoy questions from the audience, you can use the chat box again and select Sarah Elmeligi. Select question for staff, and we will put those questions to Sarah at the end of the presentation. So we'll have dedicated time for questions, but you can submit them at any point during the presentation. And don't worry, if we don't have time to get to your question today, we will take any questions that we aren't able to ask Sarah today and take them offline and make sure we get you an answer as soon as possible. And finally, at Eco Canada, we really want to know what you think about our webinars and how we can keep improving our series. So you'll be sent a short survey after the session ends today. If you could just take a couple of minutes just to let us know what you thought about today's presentation, how we could keep improving, and topics that you would like to see moving forward, we would really appreciate it. So today's webinar is brought to you by Eco Canada. Eco Canada is the steward for the Canadian environmental workforce across all industries and sectors. We champion the end-to-end career development of an environmental professional and try to identify and address labour market gaps. This is all geared towards supporting sustainable and responsible economic growth and ensuring that the environmental best practice is always a priority. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's guest speaker, Sarah Elmeligi. Sarah has a PhD and has been researching how people and bears have shared the landscape for over 15 years. Sarah has spent her career finding ways to meaningfully contribute to ensuring human practices are sustainable and in balance with the needs of wildlife and ecosystems. Sarah is an interdisciplinary landscape ecologist who integrates biological and social research to improve land management within the realities of our changing world. Sarah believes in effectively engaging diverse communities, industries, and stakeholders to find innovative solutions to complex environmental problems. Welcome, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. Can you hear me okay and all of that's good?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. Okay, well, let's get on to it then. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining the webinar today. I was remarking to Hannah earlier that this is kind of funny because I think this might be one of the biggest audiences I've spoken to, but I can't see any of you. So I hope that you enjoy the talk. My email and contact information will be on the last slide, and so if you want to email me with questions, you're welcome to do that after the webinar is over. I'm going to be talking today, the name of my talk today is What Bears Teach Us, which is actually the title of an upcoming book. But in order to really get to the heart of what bears have taught me over my career, I want to be able to share with you some of my research and just some anecdotes of how I've progressed in my career that has kind of led me to writing this book. I want to say that every single picture of a bear in today's presentation is taken by John E. Marriott, who is the person I've partnered with for the book. So I haven't always credited him in the photo, but if it's a bear, John took it. I wanted to start by recognizing Earth Day. And with the recent COVID-19 pandemic and Earth Day, I've been thinking a lot about our relationship with the natural world. Research suggests that COVID-19 arose from bats in Chinese wildlife markets, and some scientists are linking this pandemic to global biodiversity loss and the illegal wildlife trade. And that feels really far away from our daily lives in Canada, and yet it's something that is very actively impacting every single day of our life right now. For me, this pandemic has made me think a little bit about our relationship with the natural world. How do we treat nature, and how do we expect it to treat us? We sometimes consider ourselves separate from nature, but many teachings encourage us to see ourselves as a part of nature. We are part of ecosystems, and how we interact with nature has vast implications beyond what we can even comprehend. And that is how I work with bears. How we interact with bears is part and parcel of how they interact with us. To get into it a little bit more, I want to take a step back and let you know that I am an Alberta girl. I grew up in the grasslands and the mountains, and I spent my childhood recreating in Alberta parks, way before I was a bear biologist. I would hike with my parents, and we knew that bears were there, and we always took efforts to not run into them. My mom used to buy me a Coke to get me to the top of the hike, which was always a special treat. The second treat was that when I finished the Coke, I could put rocks in the can and shake the can all the way up the trail to make some noise. My mom used to tell me, that tells the bears you're coming. Fast forward to my adult life, and I had always believed I should never want to encounter a bear because they are dangerous and can hurt me. That's true, for sure, in some ways, but it isn't that simple. Over the years, I have come to learn that bears are so much more than scary stories told in the newspaper or fluffy teddy bears from cartoon movies. My master's work showed me that bears didn't always want to run away from people. My PhD taught me how bears select habitat around people depends on many different things, but mostly depends on the individual bear. Throughout my research, I have learned that regardless of where you are and what bear population you're working with, the human experience is an essential part of any encounter. Wildlife management is usually just as much people management. One of my profs said this to me, and it often comes to my mind when I consider my research questions and a lot of the work that I do. In terms of research, this idea has prompted us to incorporate social science with biological science, and that helps me create final management recommendations that address bears' biological needs while addressing the perspectives of people. Since most management recommendations pertain to managing how people use the land in one way or another, and not often directly managing how the bears use the land. In terms of the conservation work I do, keeping people in mind helps me to think about what we can all do to make the bears of lives better and easier. My master's research was the first time I actually had started working with grizzly bears. At the time, BC Parks was creating a series of North Coast Conservancy protected areas in the Great Bear Rainforest. And they wanted someone to create a baseline data set that would define the impacts of boat-based viewing tourism on grizzly bear behavior in the Kootzmatine Inlet. And that was so that their final management plan could be based on current scientific research. As with any research project, before I went out to the field, I defined my research questions, and I really wanted to combine biological data about grizzly bear behavior with social research through a visitor survey to come up with management suggestions that were applicable, likely to be supported by stakeholders and tourists, and founded in biological science research. For bear behavior, I wanted to know how many vessels enter the Kootzmatine Inlet, what their purpose was, and what grizzly bear behavioral reactions to these vessels were. For visitor perceptions, I wanted to ask questions about what parts of the bear viewing tour were people most satisfied with. Did the quality of the tour affect their satisfaction? Did tourists perceive negative impacts of the industry on grizzly bears? And what kind of management options were people supportive of? I'm not going to get into all of that in this talk. I'm going to kind of zoom through this pretty quickly. But then I got out into the field. And this is the only photo of a bear that is mine and not John's. This is the very first grizzly bear I saw up close. And this is the first photo that I took. And he was so close, and he made my heart stop beating for a second. I could hear him chewing. And he looked up at me as we approached in our little Zodiac, and this long drop of water like dropped from his lower lip to the ground, and he was lazily eating grass along the water line. We made eye contact and my heart skipped a beat, but he looked at me as if to say, "Hey, what's up?" He didn't really care that I was there. And we puttered away slowly, leaving him to his lunch. And that moment didn't really change that bear, but it forever changed me. I quickly realized as a behavioral ecologist that a lot of the things that I had assumed in my life and was bringing forward to my bear research may be wrong. I had been taught things about bear behavior, and many of them started to be proved wrong in that one interaction that lasted a couple of minutes. Over my summers in the Coots, I learned a great deal about bears, some of which I could summarize in my thesis, and some of which, like the moment I met this bear, I could not. So what did I find in my master's thesis? Well, it was all about measuring behavioral differences. So I classified bear behavior into 5 different categories, and I tested to see if the proportion of those behaviors changed when bear viewing tourist boats were in the area and when they weren't. I ran a whole bunch of different statistical tests, and if you're interested in the statistical analyses of this work, you can email me and I can share some peer-reviewed papers with you. The first behavior I measured was unobservable. So this is like when a bear is sort of on the edge of the trees and it's going in and out of visibility. And that didn't change very much whether or not there were boats in the area. The next thing I looked at was vigilance. So this is the point where a bear stops eating to stare at something intently, usually some kind of disturbance or some kind of curiosity. With one test, vigilance increased significantly, and with another test, it decreased significantly. And this was the first glimpse that I got into understanding that individual bears could drive statistical results. This increase and decrease from these 2 different statistical tests were actually based on the behavior of individual bears, skewing the results in one direction or another. I wanted to look at running, and there was a significant increase in running behavior when boats were in the area. But there was no significant difference in foraging. And this is where it's really important, because for bears, it's all about food and consuming as many calories as possible. So as long as they're eating and those rates aren't changing, then bears are less likely to be impacted by boat viewing tourism. And same with walking, there was no significant difference whether or not boats were in the area. I had been asked to define a distance beyond which, like a bear boat distance, beyond which bears would be more likely to be displaced from the shoreline and the important habitat that was there. So I had 2 different measures. The first was the mean alert distance. So this is the point at which, as a boat is approaching, this is the point at which the bear stops whatever it's doing to look at the boat. It notices the boat for the first time. And you can see those mean alert distances ranged from 168 to 452 meters, which is huge. That's a massive difference. But I also wanted to look at the threshold distances of displacement. So at what point does a bear physically leave the shoreline when a boat is approaching? And you can see that range is even greater, from 88 meters to 440 meters. So to me, I didn't know what to do with this. How could I possibly come up with a bear boat minimum distance when I had this much range in bear response? So my next step then was to look at the visitor data. So sometimes there's an assumption among commercial operators and tourists and whoever that people want to get as close as possible to a grizzly bear to be satisfied with their tour. And I just didn't think that that was true. I thought if you're from a very far away land and you're seeing a grizzly bear for the first time, it probably doesn't matter if you're 5 meters away or 100 meters away. You're going to think it's amazing. So I measured visitor satisfaction with their tour and compared that to the tour's characteristics. And what I found was that visitors on the whole were very satisfied with their tour experience, even if they saw a few bears and were far away from them. But I also found that visitors didn't necessarily want to sit in a boat and watch one bear for hours on end either. So looking at these graphs, if you look at the middle graph, you can see the bear boat distance, that when people are 76 to 150 meters away, they're still 4 out of 5 satisfied with their bear viewing tour. And obviously satisfaction increases as people get closer, but it's never low. The other thing that was interesting was that people were most satisfied when they watched a bear for about 20 to 30 minutes. And they like it when they see many, many bears. So not 1 to 3, but if they saw more than 6 bears, they had a great tour. So I combined the biological and the social data to come up with this list of management implications and recommendations. And many of these recommendations were actually incorporated into the initial drafts of the bear viewing guidelines for the province of BC. Most of my recommendations are still reflected in a brochure for park visitors when they visit the Coutts Mateen. But the big thing is that I did say that vessels should not view bears closer than 75 meters and for longer than 20 minutes. But that is based on the social science because I could not extract those numbers from the bear science. I finished my master's and I returned to Alberta, and I began working in the environmental nonprofit sector, where I campaigned to create new protected areas and prime grizzly bear habitat and help communities implement bear aware programs and initiatives. So I really started working more closely with communities around bear management, which was so rewarding. But still, every time I went for a hike in the mountains of my backyard and saw a bear sign, I wondered where the bears had gone. What happened to the bears when people were everywhere? Did it even matter? Did people even care or acknowledge that they're sharing space and habitat with bears? I had never wanted to do a PhD. I was so finished after my master's. I'm not interested in being a university professor. I really didn't want to do a PhD, but you know what? I had this burning question and this burning desire, and nobody could tell me the answer. And so I embarked on the PhD so that I could answer my own question. My PhD focused in Banff, Yoho, Kootenay, and Jasper National Parks in Alberta and BC. And my goal was to integrate biological and social science to define management tactics that will maximize grizzly bear habitat security and meet hiker expectations of bear management in Canada's Rocky Mountain National Parks. I knew I needed an integrated interdisciplinary approach because I know that bear management is people management, especially in some of Canada's most iconic and highly visited national parks. So I collected data on people and bears. I collected data from August 13 to August 2015. And I had 3 data sources. First, I had a series of remote cameras deployed on randomly selected trails from May 1st to October 15th. They were set up at trail junctions and midway points between junctions in a trail network. And over my field seasons, I had a total of 423 cameras deployed on 81 trail networks in the national parks over 8,278 camera trap days. I also conducted a trail user survey where I disseminated surveys at randomly selected trailheads in the mornings. And the surveys assessed hiker preparedness, support for management options, expectations of management. And in total, I got 696 surveys and had a response rate of just over 62%. And then I also had GPS collar data from Parks Canada from 27 different grizzly bears that I could look at their habitat use and selection patterns. So what did I find? Well, what I first found was that remote cameras are a great tool to collect wildlife data because they allow us to have a window into the wilderness without being there. As a behavioral ecologist, this has always been something that I have wrestled with. How can I measure animal behavior in ways that guarantee I haven't impacted it simply by being there? Remote cameras provide a great solution to that. Bear use on trails in the bears use trails in the national parks to navigate the landscape. The cameras showed that they were more likely to use trails when the trail was in high quality habitat. Bears were also more likely to use trails that were away from roads in the spring and summer. This seemed intuitive, but it's also important to remember that bear home ranges in the spring and summer tend to be in the valley bottoms and closer to roads. So while bears are using valley bottom habitat, they are using the parts of their home range that are as far away from roads as possible. Interestingly, the volume of people on trails and the things people were doing on trails, like mountain biking, hiking, horse riding, etc., did not influence whether bears were captured on camera. Measuring human use on trails can happen in a variety of ways, though. So you can measure the total volume of people on a trail over a day, a week, or a month. But we can also use the camera data to measure the time of day that people use trails. When I looked at how people use trails during the day, I found something a little different. I did a threshold analysis to try to see if there was a volume of people beyond which bears would be less likely to use a trail. And I found that bears were more likely to be detected on trails before 8 human events since dawn, or 17 human events per day. So the frequency of human use on a trail influences whether or not bears use it, but this still didn't answer the question of where the bears go. But at least I was starting to see that bears were changing their habitat use around people. I know that this slide is a little bit text heavy, and there's actually quite a bit of information here. So I invite you to look at the webinar again and pause the slide here, pause the show here so you can really look at all this information and get a better understanding of it. The GPS data concurred with the camera data. Habitat quality is the biggest predictor of where bears are going to go. If the food is good, bears will be there. The GPS data was similar, but actually helped to answer some of the questions I had from looking at the camera data alone. So again, bears were more likely to use habitats closer to roads and trails in the fall, but farther from roads and trails in the spring. So I mentioned that the spring home ranges are in the valley bottoms. In the fall, grizzly bear home ranges are in the high elevations far away from roads. So even if it looks like they are using habitat closer to roads, there aren't really any roads nearby in the fall. This supported my thought that bears are forced to use habitat close to trails in the spring because that is what is available. And this is why it's more common for us to see bears during the spring along the roadside. Also, the vegetation is really good along roadside in the spring. Bear movement rates changed too. So bears moved more when they were close to roads, suggesting that they could be using roads and wider trails as travel corridors. They also moved more during the day, showing that they're diurnally active, which means that unlike other bear populations in high areas of human use, our bears haven't started to switch over to nocturnal behavior patterns. The complexity of these results were evident in the level of individual variation. I have a series of graphs I could show you where the individual response to trails and roads is all over the map. I have 2 females with cubs that select habitat close to high-use trails and 2 females with cubs that select habitat away from high-use trails. This has management implications because it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. That's why it might be easier to manage the people. So what do the people say? Well, about half of the trail users coming to the parks took some kind of preparatory step for their recreation experience in bear country. So they had a first aid kit with them, or but only 37.5% of people had bear spray. So they're acknowledging that they're in a wilderness-y kind of setting that requires some planning, or at least half of them are, but not all of them are thinking about bears in the context of that. In general, people were supportive of management options that in the green there that targeted the specific aspects of the trail. So the trail being open for certain times during the day, or no dogs being allowed on the trail, or closing the trail. All of those were really supported management options if a bear was in the area or if the trail was going through high quality bear habitat. The management options in red are ones that were opposed to by trail users, and you can see that those management options were ones that specifically targeted the bear. So relocating the bear, applying aversive conditioning, those were actually opposed by trail users. If we look at how trail users feel about a lone grizzly bear versus a female grizzly bear with cubs, there's some difference in there too. So the dark blue lines represent management options that were more supported if a lone grizzly bear was in the area. And you can see that if it's a lone grizzly bear in the area, people were more supportive of applying aversive conditioning, or for Parks Canada to do nothing, or even encouraging people to hike the trail. But if it was a female with cubs in the area, people were much more conservative. They were way more open to closing the trail, not allowing dogs, limiting group size. And so trail users are distinguishing between the risk of running into a lone grizzly bear or a female grizzly bear with cubs, and they are sort of more open to making sure that females with cubs have more space to access the resources that they need. This research resulted in a series of management recommendations for Parks Canada that I don't really need to get into here. But one of the products I was able to create with this work is a map like this that actually combines the human use and the grizzly bear use. So each of these pink dots represents one of my remote cameras. And the bigger the dot, the more people are on that trail or passing through that area. The underneath layer, the red and yellow colors, is grizzly bear habitat quality. So the darker red color is primary grizzly bear habitat. That's where the bears want to be. And if we buffer all of the trails, which is these blue lines, we buffer all the trails by 400 meters, which is the approximate reaction distance for grizzly bears in this area, we can actually start to see where we want to prioritize management efforts, because where we have a lot of people in high quality grizzly bear habitat within that 400-meter buffer, that's where we're also going to have increased human bear encounter probability. And so during the spring, this is where Parks Canada would want to focus their management efforts and education. My PhD helped to define the specific areas of the park where management efforts could be focused to reduce encounters, but it also helped identify individual bears that were more sensitive to disturbance, which Parks Canada can use in their daily management actions. One of the most meaningful results, I think, from this work was being able to demonstrate that most trail users were willing to prioritize grizzly bear habitat use over their own recreational needs. This means that park managers can close trails in areas when bears need it, knowing that they will be supported by the majority of trail users in the national park. But after my PhD finished, it became apparent to me that my story still wasn't told. There was still something missing from the science. Throughout my research, I became more and more aware of the individual variation within bears. This idea was reflected in my data, but it was also something I witnessed every day. Over my years working with bears, I had become very aware of their personalities, events that had happened to them that predisposed them to act in a certain way, and that these things couldn't be reflected with data points and maps. Working for government, I had to create a plan based on what I thought most bears would do, but I knew that I could never address all of the things that bears do. Also, during my time away from research, I began to think as a recreationist again. I began to watch other people's interactions with bears or listen to other people's stories. I began to watch other people's interactions with bears or listen, I began to understand how the things that bears had taught me through my research framed my expectations of every encounter I had. But other people hadn't been taught those same things. I wanted to share what bears had taught me, not just the science behind my research, but what they had taught me about who they were and who I am when I'm with them. I pitched the idea to John Marriott. My text, your pictures, awesome meets awesome. It wasn't a hard sell. One of the things that makes this book project with John so exciting, and why I really think we're offering a very unique and interesting product, is not because we're both professionals in the bear world, but we're also friends and good friends. We work well together. John and I met over a decade ago when I first moved to Canmore, and over that time, we've worked on a few different projects together. All of those projects have been about communicating bear conservation issues or influencing habitat management to protect bear access to high quality habitat. What I like about working with John is that we are on the same page. We both value bears and their right to exist in a landscape where they are free to access the foods they like without people getting in the way. We both believe that people can take actions to improve the human-bear relationship, and that it's easier to ask people to cut down a crabapple tree in their yard than it is to ask a bear not to eat delicious crab apples. Over the years, we've gotten to know each other's families. We hang out, we philosophize, we share meals, and sometimes we even talk about things other than bears. He's a good friend, and I'm so lucky to get to do a project like this with him. We are a bear dream team. Joking, not joking. So what is our book about? As a scientist, I value data, and there is a ton of research about bear behavior and habitat use that the average person may not have access to. So I'm going to share some of that. Through my work and play, I've also been blessed to spend hour upon hour with bears, watching them, writing down what they're doing, and trying to understand why they do what they do. I've been elated, mystified, scared, curious, surprised, inspired, and nervous. When I think about it, a lot of what I've learned about bears and from them come from my own personal bear stories. So I'm going to share some of that too. But it's hard to describe what it's like to look into those deep brown eyes. How could I possibly put into words the depth of emotion and decision-making that I see when I look into a bear's eyes? That's why I need John. Our book weaves the science of bear behavior with stories from the field, with John's amazing photos, to bring you North America's bears in a way that you've maybe never seen them before. One of the things that brought John and I together as friends was the fact that we both spent substantial amounts of time in the Kutsumatine, which is a magical place in northwestern British Columbia. After a couple years of talking about the book and then some frustrating events at the job I was doing at the time, I decided what I really wanted to do was get on with it. Enough talk, let's start doing this thing. I envisioned a book where I told stories and John had photos to match. And to make that easier, clearly we had to spend some time in the field together. And what better place to start than the Coots? We visited the Coots in the spring of 2019. And although I had a book outline at this point, I had no idea which chapter our stories from the Coots would be in. We were in the Kutsumatine during mating season, and it was action-packed. Here is an excerpt from that story from the field that's in the book. Then there's Brutus, an old male at Mouse Creek. He's photographed on the right in this slide. He's one of the veterans of the Coots at a ripe age of over 30. He's a big bear. His eyes are tired and he moves slowly. His left ear is partially missing and he has many small scars along the left side of his neck from fights gone by. Over the years, this bear has held his ground against other big males and he's won. His fur is rough and worn with age. He's occupying Mouse Creek because he is the king, but he's lost weight over hibernation and his hip bones jut prominently from his backside. In the past 3 days, he's moved less than 200 meters from one end of Mouse Creek to the other. He doesn't care about our boat. He doesn't seem to care about anything. His main focus right now is eating and trying to conserve as many calories as possible so that he can be ready for when the females come. He waits patiently, eating and sleeping and trying to get strong again. In Samspanocknock Bay, there's a courting pair. They're photographed on the left on this slide. These are young bears. The female, known as Hot Chocolate, is about 6 years old. Her courtier is a young male new to the Kutsumatine. He is not a big bear, barely bigger than her. He seems young and early out of the gate, trying to get a piece of the mating action before he's out-competed. Hot Chocolate is a very tolerant bear who's been around bear viewing boats her whole life. The suitor has not. He is more wary of the boat, and we slow down to about 300 meters away to ensure we don't disturb him. Often as we approach, he takes a few steps back into the forest and looks over his shoulder at Hot Chocolate, who chooses not to leave the shore. She tries to reassure him by staying put and continuing to eat the sedge grass. Sometimes he comes back to join her, and sometimes she goes and joins him. It's a funny game they play at alternating who is the boss. It's her beach. She's lived there for years, so he is in her house. But he's the male, even if he is a little young. He's tried to mount her a few times while they've wrestled in the grass, rolling around and rubbing noses. She's walked away. She's not ready. Courting takes time. A male bear needs to wait until the female is fully in estrus before she will be receptive. Hot Chocolate just isn't there yet, and so he waits for her to be ready. Patience is a virtue, even if you're a bear and mating season only comes once a year. This story actually took an interesting turn that isn't captured in the book. You'll have to go to my blog to read how it ends, and there's a link to my blog at the end of the slideshow. When I first started thinking about the book and conveying bear behavior and what we learn from bears, patience and tolerance was the first behavioral characteristic that came to my mind. And even though that last excerpt was about bear-to-bear patience, I was really more thinking about how patient bears are with us. Bears, particularly those living in high human use areas, show incredible patience. I am often amazed by how few bear attacks there actually are when I consider human behavior in bear habitat. I giggle at the thought that I would make a bad bear because I would bluff charge too many people for violating my personal space while I was trying to eat lunch. There are many questionable things that people do to get close to a bear for a photo or a story to tell their friends. Many people get far too close, and most of the time the bear does nothing. Few people would be so patient and tolerant as an Alberta bear if they had dozens of people closing in on them to take a photo while they were eating. Bears in these cases may even be justified in huffing or growling or even swatting people away. Yet they don't. They continue eating and amble away. Bears display patience and tolerance with people and other bears, but they can also become habituated or food conditioned. And to the average person recreating or living in bear habitat, these terms may seem synonymous, but to the wildlife manager, each of these terms is different and comes with a unique series of assumptions, understanding, and management actions. In the first chapter of our book, I really explore this topic in a little bit more depth and the management implications associated with it. There are a lot of things that can lead a bear to being more tolerant or more habituated, and a lot of it has to do with what they eat. I want to talk a little bit about bears on the coast, because really one of the reasons why I have done this career path in the way that I have and written this book is by watching and working with bears on the coast versus bears in the interior. There's two things that are in abundance in the coastal rainforest that don't exist in the interior of Alberta: water and salmon. I know that seems super obvious, and maybe I've just blown your mind, who knows? But these two things change everything about the ecosystem. Water falls from the sky in the coastal rainforest in some form on most days. There are over 30 names for rain in the town of Prince Rupert. It can be spitting, pouring, misting, coming down hard, drizzling, or straight up raining. Each of those words means something different to a local, but the point is that it's always raining. This water penetrates every molecule of the forest: the leaves, needles, branches, mosses, lichens, and soils. Everything is wet. If you've ever tried to grow a garden in Calgary, you know how much plants love water, but you also know that water isn't enough to make big, happy plants. They need fertilizer too. Introducing salmon, a true keystone species. Salmon feeds everything in this ecosystem, from the large carnivores in the ocean like orcas, seals, and sea lions, to the bears and wolves on land. When a bear eats a salmon, it may or may not eat the entire fish. It usually just eats the brains and sex organs, as they are the highest in fats and proteins. The rest of the salmon is scavenged by wolves and ravens, who take the carcass into the forest and away from competitive bears. They eat what they want of the salmon and leave the rest to rot in the forest. The salmon, who's been living in deep ocean for 4 years, has accumulated an abundance of nitrogen in its skeleton, and as it decomposes, the big cedars absorb that deep water nitrogen and get there full of fertilizer. In this way, the salmon feeds nearly every species in the rainforest. From the spring to the fall, the Kootzmatine is rich bear habitat with consistently plentiful, high-protein food. With limited interference from humans, bears are free to eat as much as they want. Bears here are very tolerant of people and other bears. Apart from mating season, it is not uncommon to see bears in proximity without signs of conflict. This is largely because there's no need to compete for food when there's so much of it. Bears don't need to invest energy in defending their food sources. This tolerance also translates into a high degree of tolerance to people, which is optimal for bear viewing. Overall, the bears in the Kootzmatine show less signs of stress and aggression. Life is good and easy here. The abundance of food makes bears more relaxed, but in the interior, it can be opposite. Less food, less resources, and more people contribute to bears feeling more defensive and perhaps having a lower tolerance for disturbance. I explore this idea more in my book and talk about how that influences our management actions to keep bears and people safe and happy. Our next field trip was a trip to the Yukon. John and I went with our families up there, and what immediately struck me was how vast the wilderness is up in the Yukon. I live in the Bow Valley in Alberta, and we have thousands of people and about 60 grizzly bears. But in the Kluane region in the Yukon, there is 1,200 grizzly bears estimated, and the nearest population is the village of Haines Junction, which has a few hundred residents. So it's a completely opposite situation. With 2 to 3 times as many bears as people, bears have all kinds of space, and that makes them different bears. It was on this trip that I began to think about what it meant to coexist and how that is different based on where you are in the world. To coexist requires adaptation. You need to adapt to being around each other, but who has to do most of the adapting depends on who is the more dominant species. In the Yukon, it wasn't people that dominated the landscape, and this changed what it meant to coexist. In Canada's dynamic landscapes, what it takes for bears to adapt and coexist varies across man-made boundaries, between towns, between provinces and territories, and over the international border we share with the US. This is a massive challenge for bears because they don't always know how to be a good bear or what behaviors make them problem bears. In reality, even the terms good bear and problem bear are defined by people. Bears are really just bears. We have written a very complex rule book for bears to be good bears, but the challenge is that bears don't actually read English and they probably don't care about your rules anyways. Up in the Yukon, it's the opposite. The bears have written the complex rule book for people, and they're more than happy to let you know when you've stepped outside of their box of human behavior expectation. This bear on the left, photographed on this slide, this is right after he bluff charged me, but to know more about that, you'll have to get the book and read the story in there. When bears don't behave as we expect them to, they are essentially punished through management options. Some people believe that this repeated punishment can cause, wrong button. Some people believe that this repeated punishment can cause bears to be more aggressive around people over the long run, thus reinforcing assumptions that bears are violent and out to get us. Even though research has shown reality is far more complex than these simple assumptions indicate, society continues to expect bears to behave a certain way. Regardless of how many people live in or develop an area, the local bear population must learn specific adaptations to successfully coexist. But people, however, must also learn to adapt and coexist. Coexistence is a two-way street. How we treat bears is just as much a part of the puzzle as how they treat us. In any human-wildlife encounter, people and their reactions are essential parts of the story. A person's level of fear during an encounter can also affect the public expectation of management response. In the case of large carnivore management, fear can shape tendencies to support or oppose government policies directed towards these species. The concept of fear refers to a complex emotional and somatic reaction to the experience of danger and is primarily linked to the perceived harm that the animal represents. Fear and perceived harm equate to a person's belief regarding the potential risk that they will be hurt by a bear during an encounter. If the risk of attack is overestimated, human fear of carnivores can intensify and negatively impact support for species conservation. People fear bears, especially when they are approaching settlements or in areas of human use. Think about the last time you saw a bear. How afraid were you? Why or why not? And how do you think your fear influenced the bear or your expectations of what should happen next? Perceived threat is a significant contributor in determining a person's acceptance of various management options, particularly lethal control of bears captured in urban areas and for bears involved in repeated conflict situations. Some people may perceive black bears with their smaller size and tendency to hide as less of a threat than grizzly bears. Yet in North America, wildlife agencies receive over 40,000 complaints annually related to black bears. Fear of bears is a major reason for complaints from people who are inexperienced or less knowledgeable about bear behavior. In Alberta, black bears on private property are considered vermin and can be legally shot in defense of property or life. In our communities, black bears get into garbage, make a mess, get into our fruit trees, and cause a general sense of annoyance. And people may fear the bear or the potential property damage. But our knowledge of bears is also directly influenced by how we see them. Grizzly bears in the media and other imagery like business signs, flyers, and films are often portrayed as dangerous. When I Googled movies with a bear for the book, the movies targeting adults were mostly like Backcountry, The Revenant, and The Edge, where a grizzly bear is featured on the cover terrorizing people who are running for their lives. Grizzly bears are seen as ferocious and more commonly elicit a fear response, particularly if they are seen in places where they are not expected. As I explored this chapter, bears yet again taught me how individual they were, how everything I thought I knew about bears could be upended at any moment, and how you never actually know a bear. Coexistence and how successful we are in managing for it are dependent on where we are and which bear population we're dealing with. And there are many things that wildlife managers consider when defining management objectives around coexistence, like habitat quality and availability, which in my research, we know that's where bears want to be. So where is the high quality habitat and how close it is it to human development areas? Bear behavior. Are bears in the population habituated to human food sources? And what is their history in terms of attacks and conflict in the area? Bear population. Is the population threatened, hunted, or prolific? Human population and land uses. How many people are on the landscape and what are they doing? Is the human population density concentrated in towns or spread out across the landscape? And finally, human expectation and safety. How comfortable is the community living with bears? And do people have expectations regarding living with bears? All of those questions are asked by wildlife managers as they prepare to figure out how to coexist with bears. But if there's one thing I've learned through all of my research and all of my work, it's that a bear is not just a bear. Sometimes they are silly and sometimes they stare at you with daggers in their eyes. Sometimes bears make you know who is boss, and other times they don't even care if you're there. Research shows us that bears are individuals, and so does personal experience. Research can help us understand how bears use habitat and what is important to them as they make daily decisions about where to be, what to eat, and who to be around. Experience can help us understand the personalities of each bear, even if we only see them once. Look at the two bears in these photos. This is the whole reason why I wanted to partner with John on this book. When you look at the black bear on the right, you can tell he's annoyed. His hackles are up, he's staring intently, he even has a furrow in his brow. The bear on the left doesn't care about you at all. I don't know what it cares about, but it's not you. At the end of the day, what bears have taught me is just to be yourself, and don't be afraid to make it clear how you feel. I wrote this book to help people think about their relationship with bears and maybe to see them a little differently when they encounter them or hear other people speak of them. Bears, just like nature as a whole, have a lot to teach us. We just have to sit still long enough to listen. And that's my contact information. Mine and John's book is going to be released in late October this year, and you can pre-order copies already. And there's all of my contact, and please feel free to reach out if you have any questions at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, for that wonderful presentation. So interesting to hear about all of your research and what it's kind of meant for bear tourism and bear kind of our perceptions of bears as well. I first met Sarah about 10 years ago, my very first time visiting Canada from England as part of my master's degree, and we did a study tour around Alberta and BC, and Sarah was one of the researchers that we spoke to while we we're here. So I'm so excited to be able to work with you on this webinar and to see where your research has taken you since then.
I can't hear anything. If I'm supposed to be hearing somebody asking questions or something, I can't hear anything.
Oh. Can you hear me now, Sarah? Vanessa, are you on the line? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Hannah.
Okay. Looks like we've lost Sarah right now. Sarah, can you hear? We do have some questions for Sarah. Bear with me one second. But it looks like Sarah's having some issues hearing us. Sarah? Okay, I think we're having some technical issues with Sarah. If we can get her back, we will put our questions to Sarah. If not, we have some great questions here from the audience around bear spray, types of measures that people can take to be effective. We will just give Sarah a couple of minutes while I talk a little bit to see if we can get her back online.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey, Sarah. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. I think we were having a slight connection issue, but so you can hear me okay?
Yes, definitely.
Perfect. We do have some questions from the audience, Sarah. So I did a little speech about how we'd met, and you know, it was so nice to see you again after 10 years. But we'll move on now to my colleague Vanessa, who's going to take the questions from the audience and ask you them.
Great.
So the first question we have here is, what qualities classify good bear habitat?
Well, I think it really, I mean, the precise qualities really depend on where you are in the world. It's very tightly related to food. So bears are in hibernation for 5 months of the, 5 months of the year. So they have 7 months of the year to eat all of their calories for 12 months. So they're incredibly food driven. So habitat quality is really related to what food is available, how much of it is available. And the other thing is that habitat quality has also been shown to be related to how many people are there and what kinds of human activity, industrial development, and that sort of thing is present. So the more human activity and the more human development, the lower the habitat quality.
Okay, next question we have here is, was Parks Canada open to making any alterations to trail management given your findings?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because Parks Canada, you know, supported and funded the project with in-kind support. One of my committee members was a wildlife manager in Parks Canada. So yeah, they were definitely open to implementing some of my findings. My findings were more applicable to like day-to-day management actions. So I think it was much more useful when I presented my findings to the actual resource conservation staff that are out on the landscape making decisions to close trails or aversively conditioned bears or whatever. And so, yeah, it did.
Okay. Another question here is, do you think the percentage of people carrying bear spray on trails is enough? Did you survey people on their knowledge of proper use of bear spray?
No, I mean, one of the things I found really interesting was that 80% of people going into the backcountry had bear spray, but only like 30% of people in the front country were carrying bear spray with them. But my research really showed that it is in the front country, on the trails around town, where people have the highest likelihood of encountering a bear on a trail. So people going into the backcountry have this additional perceived risk. I'm going far away from human civilization and settlement. I need to be prepared, and bear spray is part of their preparation. But a lot of people just going for a short walk or a dog walk or a half-day hike aren't carrying bear spray, but they should be. Like, bear spray is an important safety measure in the interior, and it has been shown to save lives. And I think that it also means that when you grab your bear spray and attach it to your hip belt when you're leaving the house to go for a hike, there is instantly an awareness that you could see a bear. And I think that that changes how you are on the trail walking through bear habitat, because you've already had this conscious decision to consider bears in your recreational activity.
Would you ever say that people are choosing not to carry bear spray because they were concerned about accidentally impacting themselves rather than lack of preparation?
Oh yeah, I'm sure there's lots of reasons why people don't carry bear spray with them. I mean, another barrier is that bear spray is actually pretty expensive, and when people are just visiting the parks for the weekend, they don't always feel like it's necessary to invest in a $45 can bear spray for one hike. And some of our tourism and commercial businesses in the Bow Valley are now starting to offer bear spray rentals for people like that. But yeah, there's lots of reasons why people don't carry bear spray with them. And the more research into what those motivations are would be really interesting.
How do you think the current pandemic events, such as reduced human activity, has affected bear behavior?
Well, I am so fascinated by that, and I've been reaching out to a lot of my colleagues to see who is collecting data right now that national parks are closed, there's nobody in them. I like to envision that bears are just having a heyday out there. They're just having a big party because there's nobody around. They can be wherever they want and do whatever they want, and nobody cares. I did read an interesting article last week, which was more about urban coyotes, but was suggesting that, you know, animals right now have a lot of freedom that they don't normally have because human activity has been so restricted right now. And that's going to change how all wildlife is using habitat in and around people, whether that's urban wildlife or wildlife in our parks. And we're going to have to be very aware of that when these restrictions are lifted and we're able to recreate outside and in our parks again. We'll have to have a little bit extra kindness and awareness and recognize that we again will be changing the rules for animals, and they might be surprised by that. So there is some people who think that conflict incidences may increase when restrictions are lifted, just because animals are starting to move into habitats where they wouldn't normally be. But time will tell, honestly.
Are there any recent policy changes or proposed policy changes in Western Canada we should be aware of that may negatively affect bears/bear habitat?
I mean, there's always policy things and developments happening that have the potential to negatively affect bears and their habitats. One of the greatest wins, I think, that's happened in the last couple of years is the BC trophy hunt for grizzly bears is now canceled or over or not happening anymore, which is great. But there's always pressure in both Alberta and BC to reopen the hunt. And I think that that pressure will always be there. And that's a continual, like, low-grade threat. Research very clearly shows that the biggest threat to grizzly bear habitat quality is road density. So roads that we use to access industrial activity on public lands, and other linear disturbances like seismic lines or even highly used trails. All of those things basically fragment and cut up grizzly bear habitat and can be threats to habitat quality. The challenge is that, like, when you look at something like clear-cut logging, for example, there can be positive attributes to grizzly bear habitat quality because clear cuts open up the forest canopy and a lot of shrubs grow and a lot of bear foods will grow into those new open spaces. And so the forage quality may increase, but it is really the road density and all of our access into wilderness that is truly the biggest threat into like for grizzly bear habitat quality and conservation.
And we have a couple more questions. Have you found any techniques that are really effective for communicating bear needs with humans?
Well, I think the storytelling, which is kind of why I wanted to write the book, is really important because bears really do trigger people's imaginations. And a lot of people have preconceived notions of bears that they maybe even haven't thought of before. So storytelling, I think, is a really important tool to convey the need for bear conservation initiatives. I also think it's important to really embrace listening and working productively and collaboratively with many stakeholders. There are many, many people who are impacted by bears in very different ways, like from cattle ranchers to oil and gas, like camps, like work camps, and other forms of industrial activity, to recreationists, to people who just own acreages on like the urban wildlife interface, or even people who live in towns like mine, Canmore. We're all impacted by bears in different ways, and all of those impacts change our perceptions of what we think should happen. And so working collaboratively and listening, truly, truly listening, and increasing our ways of knowing is critical for bear management and people management to be successful.
Awesome. Another question is one type of bear more aggressive towards humans, or does it depend on the circumstance?
You know, I tried to look into that a little bit for the book, and the reality is that black bears, polar bears, and grizzly bears have all attacked people. I'm not sure that you can say one particular kind of bear is more aggressive than the others, because the data in terms of like the types of attacks and the scenarios in which bears are attacking people and where they are and what the species is, all of that really varies. And so it's kind of like comparing apples and oranges to say that, you know, apples are sweeter than oranges. Like, I don't know, guess it depends on the orange. So I think we get stuck. We get stuck in this pattern of thinking of this thing is more dangerous than this thing, than this thing. We'd like to try to put things in order. But what we learn through teachings of considering humans to be a part of nature, what we learn is that there isn't often a hierarchy. Situations are situations, and bears are bears, and how you react in an encounter is going to influence how that bear reacts in an encounter, and how the bear reacts in an encounter is going to influence how you react. In that moment that you're encountering a bear on the trail, does it matter if it's a grizzly bear or a black bear? Probably not. Like, you should probably have the same reaction, which is to just slowly back away and talk to the bear in a calm voice and try to remove yourself from the situation. I don't think it matters what species it is at the end of the day.
And the last question we have here is, do you think further regulation and controls are needed when it comes to bear jams in the Rocky Mountain parks?
Yeah.
For example, fines not keeping minimum distance or not staying in vehicles?
Yes, I 100% do. I think that bear jams in the national parks are starting to be quite problematic. And that's not a situation that we only see in Canada's national parks. Yellowstone National Park in the States struggles with the same thing, that bear jams have become incredibly popular, and you can have hundreds of people out of their cars. You know, I read this one story in Yellowstone last year where there was all these bears feeding in this meadow, and it turned into a tailgate party on the side of the road where people were like barbecuing and having this big party. And people kind of forget that you're there watching, you know, grizzly bears. And this is why I think our bears are so patient, because there aren't more negative encounters in that scenario, but there's often situations where you have a bear jam and a lot of people standing on the side of the road, and the bear, And the bear doesn't always have an escape route. And like maybe there's a cliff there or a river or something. And in those scenarios, I think people are taking a lot of risk because every bear, just like every person, has a line beyond which they're just like, okay, now I'm just pissed. Our trick is to make sure that bears don't get to that point. And so if keeping people inside their vehicles or limiting the number of vehicles that can stop to view a bear roadside, if better managing that reduces that risk of stressing out a bear so much that it feels like it has to react, then yeah, we should definitely enforce that more. Like think about it, think about a bear jam from the bear's perspective. How awful to just be eating lunch and have hundreds of people trying to get up in your face to take a photo. Like, it's not a relaxing situation for an animal. So I think if more people thought about it from the bear's perspective, then maybe they would be more comfortable or more accepting to tighter regulations and enforcement around bear jams, or also just driving up and taking their photo and driving on and not stopping and not getting out of the car and not, you know, increasing the stress. I personally don't stop at bear jams ever anymore. I just keep on driving because I don't want to contribute to stressing out that animal even more.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for answering all these questions. I'm going to hand it back to Hannah.
Thanks, Vanessa, and thanks, Sarah. I know we have questions that we didn't have time to get to today, but I will make sure that we forward those on to Sarah and we'll get everybody a response afterwards. Sarah, just one final question. Someone is saying they missed how that they can pre-order the book. Any tips on where they need to go to do that?
Yeah, if you just go to, so the publisher is Rocky Mountain Books. And if you Google search Rocky Mountain Books, What Bears Teach Us, you will find, like it will just pop up with a link to where the book is, and there's an order button there, and you can pre-order your books and decide which sort of group to pre-order it from and where you want it delivered and all those things.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And thanks again for the presentation. It was really wonderful. We had a lot of interest on the questions and we just really loved having you here to share your experience with our listeners today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. That was a real pleasure.
No problem at all. Now, before I wrap up and let everybody go, I just want to let you know about some upcoming webinars that we have in the next couple of weeks. So we're having another webinar next week about energy efficiency, renewable energy and your community, where Rebecca Lederman from 3D Energy is going to talk to us about how you can reduce your impact and implement solutions and technology that will reduce the impact for your community. And then on May 20th, we've got one called Preparing for the Unexpected, Why Your Business Needs an Operation Manual. And it's all about how you can really prepare your business or your organization for unexpected changes, business continuity, onboarding by proper documentation. So that's going to be May 20th. If you do have any questions or you want any more info, you can always contact me on events@eco.ca. And if you have any more questions for Sarah or you think of something afterwards, that's the email. Sarah shared her contact information before, but you can contact me on events@eco.ca. I want to just say thank you again for everybody for dialing in. A special hello to Mrs. Crank's science class, who spent their science lesson today listening to Sarah talk about bears. So we're glad that you could join us, and everybody else on the line. During COVID-19, Eco-Canada is committed to continuing to support our members and environmental professionals across Canada. So please do visit our website if you want some more information about our resources, our online training or future webinars. And we do have a COVID-19 resource hub as well. So that's www.eco.ca, and you can sign up for our newsletter and get updates about future webinars, training, content, and learn a bit more about eco. Thank you everyone for dialing in, and we'll hopefully see you again on a future webinar.